Hey everyone, it's Adam here tonight. I hope you're doing okay. You know, sometimes the day leaves us tired, the world feels heavy, and all we really want is just someone to sit with us for a while. No rush, no noise, just a quiet voice in the dark. Well, that's why I'm here. To keep you company the way an old friend would. Maybe you're driving on a long road. Maybe you're sitting in your kitchen, a single light above the table. Or maybe you're lying awake, unable to sleep. Wherever you are, I want you to feel like I'm right there with you. The truth is, nights like these are made for stories, for words we never said and memories we thought we'd buried. Sometimes they rise back up, not to haunt us, but to remind us that love, real love, doesn't ever leave. It lingers, like the smell of coffee in the morning or the sound of rain on an old roof. And tonight, I'm holding a letter. It's worn, edges curled, the ink soft with age. Not my words, but someone's truth. The kind of truth that was kept hidden for a lifetime, waiting for the right moment to be spoken. The story of love, fierce and desperate, and of loss, the kind you don't recover from. So, pour yourself something warm, settle in, because what I'm about to read, it's not just a letter. It's a confession whispered through time, and together we're going to walk through it, slowly, step by step, until every word finds its place in the quiet.
Well, I guess the hardest place to start is here, in the present. The woman who wrote this letter, she's sitting in a small wooden house, the kind that creaks when the wind moves through. Her hands are older now, lined with years, but tonight they tremble not from age, but from the weight of what she's about to write. A lamp glows faintly beside her, the kind with a yellow shade that softens everything it touches. Outside, a wind chime knocks once, then settles. And in the silence that follows, she remembers. I still remember, she writes, the first time he walked her home after school. The sidewalks were cracked, weeds pushing through, and the autumn air smelled like dry leaves and the faint smoke of someone burning wood down the street. His boots scuffed against the pavement, too big for him, but steady. He didn't talk much, not at first. Just cleared his throat, kicked a stone and kept walking beside her as if being there was enough. That night when the porch light flickered above her door, she felt safe in a way she would never feel again. Truth is, some moments never fade, not because they were loud or grand or written in photographs, but because they were quiet. And that quiet became the sound of everything she longed for. Even now, with her fingers stiff and her breath slower, she writes to him as if he's just outside, waiting, boots on the step, shoulders brushed with autumn air. So here's the thing about young love. It doesn't ask for permission, it grows in secret, wild as the weeds between the sidewalks and stubborn as the roots of that willow by the river. Every chance they had, they met there. The grass was damp, the river slow, and the air always held the smell of water and mud, the kind that clung to shoes and skin. Sometimes the willow leaves brushed their hair and they laughed, not because it was funny, but because joy had nowhere else to go. I still remember, she says, the way he looked at her when he promised they'd run away someday. There was no ring, no plan, just the sound of his voice low against the rustling branches. Some nights he'd bring his guitar, strum 3 chords he knew, and hum a tune he'd made up just for her. The sound was rough, unfinished, but it settled in her chest like something true. And when she leaned closer, she swore the air smelled sweeter, like the wildflowers that grew along the bank in June. After all, promises like that, whispered under a willow tree, they're the kind you carry forever. Even when the world outside says no, even when fathers scowl across dinner tables and mothers warn with folded arms. What they felt under that tree became more than a secret. It became a life they believed they could reach. And tonight, as she bends over this letter, she admits, part of her still believes it.
You know, time has a way of making young love louder than it ever intended to be. At first, they thought they could keep it small. Just stolen glances, quiet walks home, evenings by the river where only the willow knew their names. But in a small town, silence doesn't last long. Whispers spread faster than truth, and soon her father's eyes caught what her smile had already confessed.
She still remembers the night at the dinner table when everything cracked open. The roast sat untouched, the smell of pepper and smoke heavy in the air. Her father's fork hit the plate with a sound that made her flinch, sharp as a hammer against stone. He asked her where she'd been, why she smelled of river mud and wood smoke. She tried to lie, but her voice shook, and across the table, her mother looked down, folding her napkin tighter, as if silence could protect them both. God! The way she writes about that night, it still bleeds through the paper. The shame, the fury, the sound of a door slamming so hard the windows rattled. What she felt most wasn't fear of her father. It was fear that her love would now be hunted, cornered, crushed, before it even had the chance to grow. And the truth is, she was right. Well, what I can't forget from her letter is how hope refuses to die, even in the shadow of anger. After that night, they didn't stop meeting. They just learned to listen harder, for footsteps on the gravel, for the squeak of a screen door, for the distant cough of someone who might be watching. Every sound became a warning. And yet, the willow still gave them shelter. The rustle of its branches masked their whispers. The damp earth soaked up their fears. She recalls one evening in particular. The air was thick with the smell of rain. Though the storm hadn't come yet, he held her hand so tightly her fingers ached, and in his other hand was that guitar, strings slightly out of tune. He played anyway, humming against the quiet, his voice low and rough, and when the first drops finally fell, soft, cool against their skin, they laughed. The sound of rain on leaves, the smell of wet earth, the warmth of his hand in hers. For a moment, the world felt untouchable. Still, letters like this remind us that beauty doesn't erase the storm waiting at the edge. She knew her father wasn't finished. Every smile she shared beneath the willow felt like a coin borrowed against a debt she couldn't pay. And as she writes now, decades later, she admits, those stolen moments were both the brightest and the most fragile of her life. So, the letter shifts here and you can feel her hesitation in every line. She writes about the weight of her father's silence heavier than any words. In that house, silence was never empty. It was a threat, a judgment, a verdict. She lived in it, day after day, while the smell of tobacco clung to the curtains and the ticking clock seemed to grow louder with each hour she kept her secret. She remembers, one Sunday evening, her father standing on the porch with two men from town. They talked in low voices, voices meant to be overheard. She caught phrases like, "not good enough," and "won't be tolerated." Her stomach turned to stone. Inside, her mother stirred a pot of stew, the scent of onions and pepper filling the kitchen, but even that comfort felt poisoned by the words hanging in the air outside. Truth is, she writes that this was the moment she understood love would have to fight. It wouldn't be enough just to feel it, to keep it alive under a willow tree. If they wanted a life together, they would have to run, and she admits, her heart leapt at the thought. Because at 17, running away sounded less like fear and more like freedom. I still remember, she writes, the night they made their plan. The air was warm, the kind of summer heat that sticks to your skin, and the fireflies lit the field like small, wandering lanterns. He held her hand beneath the willow, his thumb tracing circles against her wrist. He told her he'd saved some money from the mill, enough for a bus ticket, enough to get them out of the county, maybe farther. He smelled of sawdust and sweat, sharp and real, and she swore she had never loved him more. The sound I hear most clearly from her words is the river, moving slow and steady beside them. It was like the river itself was urging them forward, whispering that escape was possible. She leaned her head against his shoulder, the damp fabric of his shirt cool against her cheek, and she whispered yes. Yes to leaving, yes to a life that was theirs alone, and when he kissed her hair, she swore the willow leaves rustled like applause. Still, the letter carries a tremor here, because even as she wrote about that night decades later, her hand pressed harder against the paper. She knew what came next, and she knew it was the moment that shaped everything, the moment where love tried to rise and power struck it down. You know, when young hearts decide to run, the world feels both terrifying and wide open. She writes that for days after they made their plan, her chest felt lighter, like every step was already carrying her out of that town. In the mornings, she'd glance at her father across the breakfast table, the smell of black coffee sharp in the air, the newspaper rustling in his hands. He never looked at her directly, but she felt his silence like a rope tightening around her throat. At night, she folded her few belongings quietly. A dress, a pair of shoes, a book of poems with her name on the inside cover. She tucked the half-finished handkerchief into her pocket. The needle had snapped weeks ago. The thread still looped awkwardly through the letters, but she couldn't bear to let it go. It smelled faintly of soap and the cedar drawer it had been hiding in. She pressed it to her lips, whispered his name, and felt the wild thrill of knowing she would be his by morning. Maybe that's why her words tremble now. Because the night before you run is always the sweetest and the cruelest. She thought love was enough to outrun everything, but she didn't yet understand how far power can reach, even in the dark. The thing about that night is, it began like freedom. The moon was thin, hiding behind clouds, and the air smelled of wet grass and gasoline from a truck parked down the road. She slipped out of the house quietly, her shoes muffled against the wooden floorboards. Every creak sounded like thunder in her ears. But once she was outside, under the open sky, her lungs filled as if for the first time. She ran to the willow, heart pounding, breath sharp. He was already there, shadow against the river, shoulders squared, though his hands shook when he reached for her. He kissed her quickly, almost roughly, the taste of salt and fear still on his lips, and for a moment she believed they could do it. The willow swayed above them, leaves brushing their hair like a blessing. The river whispered steady beside them, a promise that time itself was on their side. What I can't forget from her letter is the way it all shattered so fast. The sound of boots on gravel, the slam of a truck door, her father's voice, low, cutting, steady. And then the crack of fists against flesh, the dull thud of a body hitting earth, the smell of blood mixed with wet dirt. The willow watched. The river kept moving, and she was pulled away, screaming into the dark, her own voice swallowed by the night. So, the morning after felt like another world. She writes that the sun came up pale, the kind of light that makes everything look washed out, unreal. Her body ached from being dragged across the gravel. Her arms bruised where her father's grip had held her. The house smelt of bacon and coffee like any other morning, but it turned her stomach, because nothing was ordinary anymore. I still remember, she says, the way the town began to hum with stories. At the store, whispers curled like smoke around her name. At church, heads turned just a little too long. She caught the words fight and accident and even dead. Her hands shook so badly she dropped her hymnal, and when she bent to pick it up, the wood polish on the pews made her gag. Truth is, she didn't know what had happened to him. She had seen the blows, heard the sounds, felt the ground shake under her knees, but then he was gone. And when silence took his place, it grew roots inside her that never left. She lived each day as if half of her had been buried in that dirt by the river, under the willow that once felt like theirs. Listen. There's a way small towns carry secrets. Not openly, not honestly, but in the spaces between what people dare to say. She never saw his family again in the weeks that followed. Their house stood dark most nights, shutters closed, the yard overgrown. Some said they'd left town. Others said they were forced. And more than one voice whispered that her father had taken care of it. She remembers standing by the river once more, weeks later. The air was sharp with the smell of pine from the woods nearby, the water cold against her fingers when she knelt to touch it. The willow seemed different, its leaves heavier, as if it carried the weight of what it had seen, and on one low branch she found the handkerchief. Her initials, half-stitched, the thread still hanging loose. It was damp, smelling faintly of earth and mildew, but it was proof he had been there. Proof he had left something behind. After all, proof is not the same as presence. She held that cloth against her face and breathed in until she coughed, trying to pull him back through the fabric. But fabric isn't skin. Fabric doesn't speak. And she walked home that day with her heart cracked in a way that never quite healed. Well, she thought it was over. Winter had settled over the town, snow pressing against the rooftops, the air biting at her lungs every time she stepped outside. Her father's house was quieter than ever, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the grandfather clock striking hours that seemed endless. She moved like a shadow through those rooms, carrying the weight of something unfinished. And then, one night, everything changed. She still remembers the sound first. A knock, 3 times, slow, hesitant, almost afraid of itself. The smell of wood smoke from the stove drifted through the hall as she opened the door, and the cold rushed in sharp as a blade. There he was, thinner. his coat torn at the sleeve, his face marked with scars that hadn't been there before. And his eyes. His eyes burned with something fierce, something that refused to die. Maybe that was the cruelest gift of all. Because seeing him alive meant the hope she had buried came rushing back, wild and unstoppable. Hope can be more dangerous than despair. It makes you believe again, and belief was the one thing her father could never allow. You know, she writes that when he came back, it was like the world tilted on its axis. They met again under the willow, the snow packed hard beneath their boots, their breath rising like ghosts in the dark. He held her face in his hands, rough and cold, and whispered that he wasn't going anywhere this time. He smelled of sweat and smoke, and when he spoke, his voice cracked, but it carried all the weight of survival. The willow was bare then, branches like black fingers stretched against the winter sky. The river moved slow, ice forming at its edges, groaning softly, as if the earth itself felt their struggle. She pressed the handkerchief into his palm again, damp from her pocket, the thread still unfinished. And when his thumb brushed across it, he smiled through chapped lips. He said, "This time, nothing will stop us." Still, in her letter she admits she knew better. Love can be brave, but power is patient. Her father hadn't won by chasing him off. He had won by reminding them both what he could take away. And as they stood there, shivering, trying to believe in a future, she could already hear the silence of threats waiting at her doorstep. So, Hope lived only a short while. She writes that those weeks with him felt stolen, fragile but real. They met in hidden corners of town, the diner after closing, the back pew of an empty church, the frozen path by the river. Every time, their hearts beat louder than the world allowed. But small towns notice everything, and her father noticed most of all. She remembers the night she overheard his voice in the parlor. The fire was burning low, filling the house with the smell of pine and smoke. Her father spoke to two men whose names carried weight in that county. She couldn't see them, but she heard enough. Talk of land, of reputation, of making sure this ends. The scrape of his match against the box, the hiss as he lit another cigar. It was the sound of power sharpening its blade. After all, she writes, love was never their crime. It was defiance, and defiance in her father's house was something to be crushed. The thing about power is, it doesn't always shout. Sometimes it knocks politely, with a smile, and leaves ruin behind it. Her father didn't confront the boy directly again. No, he sent men to the boy's family. They arrived one cold morning, the frost still clinging to the windows, the smell of damp hay drifting through the yard. She recalls what the neighbors whispered later, threats about rent unpaid, about jobs suddenly disappearing, about debts that could surface overnight. If they stayed, their lives would not be safe. The boy's father stood pale in the doorway, his cap in his hands, while his mother cried quietly into her apron. The boy himself, jaw clenched, fists balled, knew what was happening, and when he looked at her across the street that evening, she saw it in his eyes, rage, sorrow, and a love chained by duty. Still, this is where her letter shakes the most, because she knows he didn't walk away because he stopped loving her. He walked away because he chose to protect his family, and that kind of sacrifice leaves a wound that never heals, not for him, not for her. Well, she writes that the night before he left, the air felt heavy, like even the sky knew. She slipped out once more, heart pounding, shoes crunching on frozen ground. The willow stood waiting, its bare branches black against the pale moon. And there he was, his face thinner than she remembered, his coat patched at the sleeve, his eyes burning with something too big to hold inside. He told her everything. The men who came, the threats whispered with polite smiles, the way his mother cried at the kitchen table while his father sat silent, staring into nothing. He spoke quietly, his voice raw, the sound of it carried away by the wind off the river. He said he couldn't stay, not without putting them all in danger, and that he placed the handkerchief, her handkerchief, back into her palm. The blue thread, still unfinished, fabric, damp with frost. He whispered, "This isn't goodbye. I'll come back, I swear it." God, the way she pressed that cloth to her lips, breathing in the faint smell of him, wood smoke, sweat, and something like iron. She believed him, she had to, because the alternative was unthinkable. You know, promises can be both a gift and a curse. She carried his words in her chest like a second heartbeat, but the next morning, he was gone. No sound of boots on gravel, no shadow waiting under the willow, just tire tracks in the dirt, a patch of grass pressed flat where he had knelt, and silence so deep it rang louder than any church bell. She remembers standing there, the river slow and dark beside her. The air smelt of damp earth, of something ending, that with her swayed gently, as if bowing in mourning. She clutched the handkerchief so tightly her nails tore the fabric, and for years after, whenever she touched that cloth, she swore she could still feel the warmth of his hand in it. Still, the letter confesses what hurts most, that he didn't leave because he stopped loving her, he left because he loved too much. Because sometimes love for family is heavier than love for oneself. And that truth became the sharpest blade she ever carried. Sometimes silence is louder than words. After he left, the whole town seemed to buzz with stories, each one heavier than the last. She couldn't go to the market without hearing his name whispered behind her back. Some swore he'd been seen boarding a bus heading north. Others said he'd been dragged into a fight outside the mill, left for dead in a ditch. And one rumor, one that spread like wildfire, said her father himself had made sure the boy would never come back. She remembers walking through town, the smell of gasoline from the station hanging thick in the air, the clatter of boots on the wooden sidewalks. Every sound felt sharper, crueler. The church bells rang one Sunday morning, but instead of comfort, the notes felt hollow, mocking, like the world was reminding her she was alone. She clutched the handkerchief in her pocket, its thread still dangling, a piece of him she refused to surrender. Truth is, she didn't know what to believe. Hope told her he was alive. Fear told her he was gone, and her father's silence told her not to ask. She carried that silence like a stone in her chest, heavier with every passing day. Well, what she never expected was to see him again. It was late winter, the snow melting into muddy rivulets along the streets, the air damp with the smell of thawing earth. She heard it first. The sound of boots, uneven, dragging slightly, and when she turned, there he was, alive, thinner, older somehow, though only months had passed. A limp in his stride, a scar across his brow, but his eyes still carried that same fire, the kind that said he hadn't given up. They met again under the willow, its branches bare but waiting, the river swollen with meltwater. He held her face in his rough hands, trembling, and told her he'd come back because he couldn't leave her to a life built on her father's command. His voice cracked, but the sound of it cut through months of silence like sunlight through ice. The air smelled of wet soil, raw and sharp, and every breath between them felt borrowed, stolen from a future they still dreamed of. Still, her letter admits the cruel truth. Hope had returned, yes, but power had not forgotten, and what waited for them now would prove even harsher than fists in the dark. So, the day finally came when he left for good. She writes that it wasn't a farewell anyone spoke aloud. It was a morning like any other, the smell of damp earth after rain, the sound of wagons on the road, dogs barking in the distance. But when she stood by her window, curtain pulled just enough to see, she watched his family load their lives into the back of a truck. His mother carried boxes wrapped in cloth, his father tied down bundles of tools, shoulders hunched as if bearing more than wood and rope. And him? He stood at the edge of the yard, eyes lifted once toward the willow tree across town, as if he could see through the distance. She swore, even from far away, that he pressed his hand against his coat pocket, where her handkerchief had once been. The sound I hear most clearly from her words is the engine starting, coughing, then roaring to life. Exhaust drifted across the street, sharp and acrid, stinging her eyes as she watched. No goodbyes, no chance to run to him. Just the sight of that truck pulling away, its rattle fading into the horizon. Truth is, that silence, heavier than fists or threats, was what finally broke her, because silence leaves nothing to hold on to, only an empty street and a heart that never stopped waiting. Well, years passed. She married the man her father chose. She bore children, kept house, cooked meals, smiled at church. On the surface, she lived the life that was expected of her, but inside, she carried only the weight of absence. Every sound of boots on gravel made her look up. Every truck rolling through town made her heart stumble. Every letter delivered by the post made her hope. I still remember, she writes, the day hope finally ended. It was the summer of '68, hot and relentless, the air thick with dust and gasoline. She was in the kitchen when the mail arrived, the envelope thin and official, carrying the seal of the United States Army. Her hands shook so hard she nearly tore it in half before she could read. Inside, a single page. Words that said he had fallen overseas, in a country she had never seen, in a war she had never believed in. The kitchen smelled of boiled corn and soap. The clock ticked on the wall, steady, uncaring. Outside, children laughed in the yard, their voices high and bright. And she sank to the floor, the letter pressed to her chest, as if holding it tighter might undo the truth. Still, she writes that in that moment, grief didn't feel like screaming, it felt like sinking, like the sound of the river when it swallows a stone, quiet, final, gone.
You know, on the outside, life went on. She became a wife, a mother, a neighbor. She cooked suppers that filled the house with the smell of roast chicken and cornbread. She folded laundry warm from the lime, the sound of children running through the hall, laughter chasing one another like shadows. To anyone looking in, she was a woman settled into her role, carrying on the way women were expected to in that time and place. But inside, she was somewhere else entirely. Every night when the house quieted, she opened the drawer where the handkerchief still lay. Its fabric had yellowed, the thread frayed, but the scent of cedar lingered faintly from the box she kept it in. She held it against her face, eyes closed as if it was skin instead of cloth. And in that silence, the willow rose again before her eyes. The river whispered steady, and his voice, low, rough, unfinished, returned as if he were still there. After all, people say time heals. But, she confesses, time didn't heal her. It only taught her how to carry the wound without bleeding in public. Her smile became armor, her silence became survival. And her heart remained buried under a willow tree she could no longer visit without trembling. Sometimes, it was the smallest things that broke her, the sound of boots on a porch, the smell of pine after rain, the sight of boys in uniform laughing in a way that made her stomach twist, all reminders of what she had lost and what had been taken from her twice, once by power, once by war. She remembers one evening, years after the war, when her children were grown and the house was quiet again. She lit a single candle at the kitchen table, the room filled with the faint scent of wax and smoke. The handkerchief lay beside the flame, its shadow flickering on the wall, and she whispered his name into the stillness, her voice cracking like glass. No one heard her but the walls, the clock, and the quiet wind outside. The truth is, she lived two lives, one for the world, dutiful and steady, and one in secret, a life lived in letters never sent, in memories that never dimmed. And tonight, as she writes this final letter, she admits what she never dared to say, that her true life ended the day his did, though her body kept moving forward. Well, age has a way of slowing the body, but sharpening the memory. She writes that in her later years, the nights grew longer, the house quieter, and the past louder. The smell of liniment for her aching joints mixed with the scent of old books in her parlor. Every creak of the floorboard at night reminded her of footsteps that would never return, and every silence at the table reminded her of words she had never spoken. She still remembers sitting by the window one autumn evening. The willow by the river had long since withered, struck down by a storm, its trunk cut into pieces for firewood. But in her mind it still stood tall, leaves brushing her shoulders, river whispering at her feet. She pressed the handkerchief to her lips, now worn thin, and for a moment she was 17 again, barefoot in the grass, listening to him promise they'd run away. Truth is, memories don't age, they stay young, stubborn, bright as the day they were born. It was her body that grew old, her hands that shook, her breath that grew shallow. But her love, the one she never chose to bury, stayed sharp as a thorn under skin. It never softened, it never forgave. You know, the hardest part of her letter isn't the story of what happened. It's the story of what didn't. The mornings they never shared, the children they never raised, the home they never built. She writes those absences with more pain than the memories of fists or threats or the letter from the army.
She describes one night, not long ago, when she woke to the sound of rain. It pattered softly against the roof, steady and low, and she could smell the damp earth rising through the cracks in the windowsill. For a heartbeat, she swore she heard boots on gravel, that familiar rhythm. She rose, wrapped her shawl around her shoulders, and opened the door. But only the rain greeted her, cool and endless, sliding down the steps in silver streams. Still, she writes that in that moment, she almost smiled, because grief after so many years had softened into something else. Not forgiveness, not peace, but a kind of surrender. She realized she wasn't waiting anymore, she was remembering, and sometimes remembering is the only way love survives.
Listen, she admits now, in words she never dared to say out loud, that her marriage was never love. It was duty. A table set with fine dishes, the house kept neat, children raised with care. Yes, she did all of that. But her heart belonged elsewhere, buried in the soil beneath a willow tree that no longer stood. And though her husband gave her stability, respect, even kindness at times, it wasn't enough to touch the part of her that had already been claimed. She remembers the nights she lay awake beside him. The room smelled of starch from freshly washed sheets, the steady sound of his breathing filling the dark. But she stared at the ceiling, listening instead for a different rhythm, the scrape of boots, the strum of a guitar, the laugh that used to spill out when the willow leaves tangled in their hair. Sometimes she clenched the handkerchief beneath her pillow until her fingers cramped. A silent rebellion, a secret no one could take from her. After all, love that deep doesn't vanish when life demands it. It simply goes underground, growing roots in silence. And she carried those roots through decades, invisible to everyone but herself. God, what breaks her most is not just what she lost, but what she gave up by obeying. She raised children who never knew their mother's true story. She baked pies for church fundraisers, smiled at neighbors on the sidewalk, and played the role of a woman lucky to have what she had. But inside, she was still that girl by the river, clutching a handkerchief, whispering a boy's name to the wind. She remembers one particular evening, years after her children left home. She was sweeping the porch, the air filled with the smell of honeysuckle drifting from the garden. The broom scratched across the wooden boards, steady, familiar, and then, just for a moment, she heard music. Not from a radio, not from the street, but faint, like a guitar strumming under willow leaves. She froze, heart racing, eyes searching the yard. But of course it was only memory playing tricks again. Still, she writes that she welcomed the illusion, because illusions were kinder than truth. And sometimes when reality is unbearable, memory becomes the only place you can live. She lived there often, too often. And tonight, she confesses it without shame. Well, old age doesn't lie. It strips away the noise, the expectations, the polite smiles, until all you have left is yourself. And when she looked at herself, truly looked, she saw a woman who had lived two lives. One everyone could see, a wife, a mother, a neighbor, and one no one could see, a girl forever standing by a riverbank, waiting for a boy who never came back. She describes her nights in those final years, the house silent, the walls creaking like tired bones, the air carrying the faint smell of dust and mothballs. She'd sit at the table with a single candle, its flame flickering shadows across the handkerchief. The thread, still unfinished, glowed like a scar under the light, and sometimes she swore she could hear his voice, low, rough, unfinished, like the tune he once hummed under the willow. Truth is, she wasn't afraid of death, not anymore. She was afraid of forgetting, because if memory slipped away, if she ever lost the sound of his laughter, the smell of sawdust on his skin, the weight of his promise, then she would lose herself too. So she clung to memory the way others. So, this letter, she says, is the one she never dared to send. For decades, she kept the words locked inside her chest, as if silence could protect the pieces of him still alive in her. But now,
With her body tired and her breath shorter each day, she knows silence has only turned into chains, and tonight she is breaking them. She writes his name slowly, each letter shaky but deliberate. The ink smudges under her fingers, leaving dark stains on the page, like tiny bruises. She tells him everything. How she never stopped loving him, how every year that passed felt like a year stolen, how the life she lived was a performance for the world, not for her heart. She writes about the sound of rain, the smell of cedar, the way his laughter once fit inside the branches of a willow tree. And when she writes the word forever, she pauses as if the weight of it might break the paper. Truth is, she knows this letter will never reach him. But writing it makes him real again, if only for one night, and that, she says, is enough. You know, farewells come in many forms. Some are shouted in anger, some whispered in tears, and some, like hers, arrive decades too late, scribbled on paper by hands that tremble. She tells him she forgives him for leaving, though she knows it wasn't his choice. She forgives herself for obeying, though she knows it wasn't truly her fault. And she forgives the silence between them, though it carved out the longest years of her life. She remembers one last image. The willow, the river, the sound of boots on gravel. She writes that if there is another world after this one, she will find him there. She will stand barefoot in the grass, place the handkerchief in his palm, and this time, finally, finish stitching his name. The candle beside her flickers low, the wax dripping like the slow measure of time. Her eyes close, and she breathes his name into the quiet, softer than a prayer. Still, she ends with this. If anyone ever reads these words, know this: love may be stolen, bent, buried, but it does not die. It waits, and I've waited all my life.
And you know, after walking through this story with you tonight, I can't help but sit back and feel the weight of it. Two young souls, a willow tree, a love too strong to survive the world they were born into. And in the end, silence became their prison. Not because they stopped loving each other, but because life, family, duty, war demanded a price they never agreed to pay. What strikes me most is this: love isn't always about happy endings. Sometimes it's about endurance, about holding on to a name, a memory, a fragment of laughter, even when the years pile up and the world pretends to forget. And maybe that's what makes love sacred, not its permanence in the flesh, but its permanence in the heart. So, if you're listening tonight, take this with you. Don't wait too long to speak the words you carry. Don't let silence steal decades you can never get back. Tell them you love them. Tell them you're sorry. Tell them what you wish they knew, because truth is, tomorrow isn't promised. I want to thank you, my friends, for sitting here with me, letting these words echo in your hearts the way they echo in mine. Your time, your presence, it means more than you know. And until we meet again, may you hold your own stories close. May you honor the people you've loved, lost, or still carry within you. This is Adam, wishing you peace, gentleness, and the kind of love that never fades. Good night, and I'll see you next time.